Let's now connect with the Center Square's education reporter, Esther Wickham. Esther, thanks for taking time. Fascinating story, especially seeing and comparing and contrasting the different states and how they handle labor stoppages with teachers. Tell us about your latest and the debate growing as states consider banning such activities.
Yeah, it's definitely an ongoing debate, especially how other states around the country respond and react to the various strikes that we've seen, not only with, labor unions demanding certain things when regarding their salary or their pay, but also with recent immigration enforcement and the continued student walkouts that we see. There's this question about, do the school districts support this? Or are the teachers joining in? And so we're seeing around the country, there are strike bans or heavily restricted bans on teacher strikings in around, 37 to 38 states, including Washington, D.C. And, some states, we have Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia legislation that have explicit preventions for teachers to strike. And so there, are those specific states that say, we don't allow this. We want, these taxpayer funded jobs to be secured, and during the school day when they are doing what they should be doing, teaching their students, they're not, going out and protesting and striking and requesting more funds or whatever there is. And then looking over to other states, there are 12 states that explicitly allow teacher strikes. And it's no surprise that they are definitely more progressive states. We have Alaska, California, Colorado, Illinois, Louisiana, Minnesota, Montana, and you can see on the graphic there, the list goes on, and those specific states, have legislation that allow these strikes, and so the debate kind of continues about what should this look like on a national level.
We've seen in some larger municipalities as well, like Chicago, an example. I think they had like 3 or 4 strikes over the span of 5 years. Some of them happening amidst the ongoing pandemic. With the growing concerns of kids not being in the classroom, kids not getting the instruction they need, and a whole host of other concerns. When we think about, the taxpayer cost here, obviously teachers are getting paid and they have a union they may be part of, and that union brings to the table, we need increased pay for this, increased funding for continuing education, increased, funding for after school programs or whatever the case may be, or certain types of labor rules when it comes to the pandemic. That was a big thing. But while we're talking about the taxpayer cost, what do you think the cost is on, and are you seeing that concern of the impacts on children and their capability to learn?
Yeah, absolutely. Specifically in the state of Arizona, there is a new bill. That is one of the states that allows teacher strikes. There isn't any ban. And we're seeing, that raised concern, even on education in general. And there's been a ton of reporting out there, right? We're seeing because of the pandemic, because of school choice, because of just the public school system in general, there's concerns around our children learning, our teachers teaching, and the test scores are kind of proof and a result of that that's not necessarily happening. And so I don't think that's a direct result, but in Arizona, there's a new bill out there that would essentially prohibit public school teachers from striking or participating in organized work stoppages. And, this has definitely drawn a lot of criticism from union officials. And so the Center Square was able to talk to Geneva Fuentes, who is the communications director for the Arizona Education Association. And there's no surprise there. She's extremely against this bill. Saying that this is going to have unintended consequences for school districts. And something that she heavily emphasizes is that specific legislation is poorly drafted and it withholds funds from school districts if educators want to speak to each other about, how they're being treated, if something, goes on. And so that is one of the consequences. There are threats of withholding funding, if teachers go on strike. And this union official is saying that this could potentially impact the students if the teachers aren't allowed to go on strike.
Yeah, the union's role in this, I think, is something that obviously a lot of people are closely examining across the country, because unions, they say they're an assembly of people to fight for certain types of labor issues. But when you start looking at like state house races and the amount of political dollars that these unions are pouring into legislators' campaign coffers across the country, it really begs the question as to what is the role of that union? Is it to negotiate fair contracts? Is it to play in politics? And then you've got, of course, the Janus case that actually came out of Illinois all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court prohibiting, forcing public sector employees to be members of unions. So talk a bit about the union's impact here. And you'd mentioned earlier on, even down to the granular detail of students going out on protests and whether or not certain ideologies are being funneled into the schools through teachers, through their union.
Yeah, absolutely. The Center Square has reported a ton on how teacher unions, especially, the National Education Association or the American Federation for Teachers, these unions have a massive impact on public education. And, when you look at the membership dues, these, especially the NEA, they're making over $390 million per year on membership dues, and you see this is technically heavily funded through taxpayers, right? Taxpayers are funding these teacher salaries. In a lot of the school districts, they don't necessarily pay for the membership dues, but they deduct the membership dues from these teacher salaries, and so these unions are being heavily supported via taxpayers, and we see that impact on a lot of teachers, on a lot of students. And just like you said, the rise of, concern for immigration enforcement, is it coming on school, property, a lot of student walkouts being scheduled, being planned. We're seeing that across the country, and it's not even, over the weekend or after school. This is during school. Classrooms are empty, students aren't learning, and there's a lot of concern around that. And we don't necessarily see that being addressed or that being a concern, for these unions necessarily. I've talked to a lot of other union members, and it seems that they're more concerned about, the funding. They don't want their funding withheld, and they want to protect students. I think that everyone across the board wants to keep children safe and protected and have them learn, but the way that they go about it is going to be a little bit different, and specifically going back to Arizona, the Center Square was able to talk to the superintendent there, Tom Horn, who is a huge advocate for this specific legislation to ban to ban teacher strikes. And his main thing is, he says, sure, it's First Amendment right for teachers to strike and their right to protest, but not during school hours, right? You're taxpayer funded. It's your First Amendment right to do that, but don't do it at an unreasonable hour. Make sure that these students are being taught, and their taxpayer funded salaries are being put to good use, and make sure that they're getting the education that they need, and focused on that rather than just polarizing and politicizing everything around them in the education system.
We're talking with Esther Wickham, the education reporter at thecentersquare.com. You can see her latest talking about the ongoing debate around whether or not teachers can strike. And it's interesting to see that roughly 38 states, including Washington, D.C., banning or heavily restricting that practice. And this may be a segment for a totally different day, but have we done any kind of comparison on those 38 states and education outcomes that either ban or restrict teachers walking off the job to those states that do allow for teachers to walk off the job?
Yeah, that's definitely something I would like to do for reporting in the future. Just really go line by line and look at every single state. An article can only be so long, and people's retention rate can only be so long. But in this specific, report, I did go through some of the states, other states like Texas and Maryland. Specifically in Texas, there was a lot of student walkouts and some criticism and concern from the Texas Education Agency that teachers or the administrators within the education school districts were kind of encouraging or incentivizing these students to do that. And so the TEA kind of issued guidance after these walkouts saying, hey, this is not okay for educators and for teachers to encourage students to leave the classroom for these protests. And we're going to, do an investigation into these school districts to see what exactly is going on. because as we know, Texas is a more red state, and the attorney general there, released a statement saying, we don't want our Texas schools to be a breeding ground for radical left open border agenda, and they want their public school officials to be following the law and, not unlawfully facilitate student participation in protests that, as, they say, is targeting heroic lawful government officials. And so, especially when we come to the ICE protests and the immigration enforcement protests, it's super political and it's very polarizing. And so it's like, okay, are these 15 and 16-year-olds actually out there protesting for something they believe, or are they being told something from
or
their
are they just looking to get out of class for the day, right? I mean, that's one thing
exactly.
I was always looking for when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. How can I get out of class today? Esther,
Exactly.
Obviously there's tons of other issues that kind of traverse away from, reading, writing, and arithmetic and get into politics. And the union's involvement in that as well. I mean, we've seen it here in Illinois where they oppose school choice measures. And we've got this national bill that is allowing for states to opt into a school choice scholarship program. And we had a program like that in Illinois, but the teachers' unions seem to be instrumental in getting that measure to sunset here in the state of Illinois. So there's going to be plenty more for us to talk about in the future on this particular story of protests and unions and their involvement in education and educational outcomes. So greatly appreciate your time. Esther Wickham, the Center Square education reporter. We'll definitely connect again soon.